Well, I think I will go ahead and get started. It's really good to see everyone. We've had quite a week in our country, and I wanted to say here how grateful I was that Nathan expressed such concern and such an appropriate sentiment over some of the things we've seen this week. I'm not sure what I can add to that conversation. I think as we look at the history of Trinity in this light of understanding the racism of our past and the way the racist acts that people committed unknowingly or unthinkingly, I guess, without a lot of understanding of what they were doing or how they were harming other people. It's just, there are three things I think we need to keep in mind, and all of them kind of intersect at interesting moments. The history of Trinity is, of course, what we are most interested in, but that's definitely kind of back at the same time. We need to pay attention to what was going on in the Episcopal Church more generally. And of course, the way that the history of Oregon and Portland plays into that as well. As I read different stories about things like the Vanport flood or the Kaiser shipyards before that, the period after the Second World War and the destruction of Vanport, the dividing of Black neighborhoods with the construction of Interstate 5, I automatically wonder, where was Trinity in all of this? Were the leaders of our church, the lay leaders of our church, involved with some of the economic decisions that benefited them around the destruction of Black neighborhoods to along the I-5 corridor? We do know, thanks to Bob and Dale and their research, that Trinity did provide was used as a shelter in the period after the Vanport floods, but I'm not sure for how long, whether it was just an emergency or what the long-term situation was and how that worked out. As I learn more about Vanport and how long people were displaced, it seems it's hard to know if Trinity could have accommodated very many people for that long, just because it was so slow for the public authorities to provide any sort of housing for those people, or for the people who were displaced, the section of African Americans among those people. When I look at the history of the Episcopal Church, I continue to be surprised at how, at some level, how slow the church was to respond to, inequities in the Jim Crow South, and how we sort of worked our way through the civil rights movement. A lot of urban parishes were known for supporting the civil rights movement, and it's hard for me to see when I look at Trinity leaders if they were supportive of that movement in the same way. We just don't know. As I look through newspapers and from the period, it's really after about the 1960s and early 70s. Before that, local papers had a lot of notices about Trinity when Kempton Hall was built, when a new rector was appointed. Bishop Dagwell has a beautiful obituary from the early 60s. But after that, mention of Trinity seems to drop off. And I suspect as national events took more and more precedence in the popular imagination, that there was less attention paid to some of what we would think is kind of minor incidents in Portland. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Mainly, what do you hope we can learn from trying to look at some of these issues, or look at the issue of race through the lens of Trinity's experience? I know I was trying to find very specific things, and each time I looked for something or tried to see what I could find, I kind of came to a dead end. And I'm wondering if that silence tells us a lot about the way that the Black community was simply seen very separately. St. Philip the Deacon was established in 1911, and it's got a prominent place on the list of historic African American churches in the United States. But trying to find a little bit about about why it was founded, it seems clear to me that there was very much an understanding, and I don't think any of this is particularly surprising, but churches that African Americans, like Indigenous Americans, were seen to be separate, and it seemed appropriate for them to have their own places of worship, particularly as they struggled or as they were interested in moving into leadership roles in the white church. They were kind of shoved out into their own parishes. And I guess what the question I have is what can we do about that now? And how do we mend those divisions? I mean, we know that it took a long time for African Americans to actually be ordained in the Episcopal Church. They could be deacons, and then ultimately there was a suffragan bishop, but he was designated as the bishop of the Black churches. Looks like we have some good questions. Alan asks like to know about our complicity in racism, but the moments of resistance. And I was looking for those too, Alan, as I kind of went through things. There's a slight hint in Bishop Dagwell's obituary where it talks about he was interested in, that he was a good person in regard to all things. And, including his approach to race. But I'm not really sure what else, it's hard to find much else, quite frankly, or at least as I've looked. I think I've been a bit stymied by not being able to get into the diocesan archives because of the pandemic. I keep hoping for a treasure trove of information there. But mostly what I find has just been hints of things that are a little bit, it's hard to read them. The evidence simply isn't clear one way or the other, which makes trying to figure out what it all means is challenging. I think the pushback comes a lot from Black parishioners themselves, and certainly Blacks within the American Episcopal Church were pretty confident that they were arguing for the right thing, to be included more generously. And of course, as the Episcopal Church caught up to that and did play a positive role in the civil rights movement, then there have continued to be small steps. But as we look at it, it still feels very different from the way we are looking at race now, to both understand our own complicity, and that's always sort of difficult to get at, that we don't really, it takes a lot of education and a lot of thinking to understand the ways in which we have contributed ourselves to some of these issues. I'm wondering what other thoughts you guys have, if anybody wants to jump in, and is there a way that we as individuals can work harder to make Trinity more attuned to our approach to race? Or are we, I think at some level we're doing all we can, but we can always do more.
So there's a question here, Kimberly. Have you seen the diocese document that focuses on our history of race and our church in Oregon?
No, Barbara, do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
There is a document that was developed by the historian in the diocese, and it's something that I can share, but I don't know what resources the person used. Mm-hmm. But there are some things that talk about, there was a church that was an Asian church. There's Bishop Dagwell's work during the internment. Mm-hmm. There are a few things in it that I can share. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really specifically talk about Trinity.
Yeah, I do know Bishop Dagwell did a really good job, or tried very hard to work with all religious communities. There's some conversation that Trinity was involved in supporting the sale of the somebody's brother of somebody owned the property that Beth Israel is now on. And so that was helpful in thinking about that there was certainly an openness and an understanding that religious communities need to support the right for everyone to live, to get in harmony, but also to make sure that people have their full rights as citizens, and to make sure that everyone was welcome in the community.
I do know that there was one there was one priest who served in the Albina neighborhood, and African Americans were moving into that neighborhood. So I don't have the document in front of me. I'm sorry, I should open it up. But anyway, he was actually removed from the Episcopal Church because he was overtly racist. And there was a case that there was an African American woman who was walking with her child or children in front of his yard, and he got really upset that she would dare do that, and he hit her with his rake, or he was outside raking the leaves or doing something like that.
Barbara, when was that? Was that in the early 60s or?
No, most of the history is before the civil rights movement. Most of the history that we've gleaned is before that.
So there was also a comment, we all have to also look at the ways we have benefited from white supremacy that has been part of the Episcopal Church as well as the country, so that we can make future decisions that are more informed and compassionate and that contribute to the dismantling of that system.
Jeffrey, thank you for that. That is a good point. I mean, I think as I think about the ways that I personally have benefited, the list is very long. Having been brought up in the Episcopal Church, but as I think of that very large congregation, of course, it was almost all white people. And there was never a question that I can recall as to whether it just always seemed to be taken for granted that was the way it should be. And I'm reminded again about the sort of famous comment that Sundays are still the most segregated day in the United States. I'm not the first person to say that, obviously, but there is something very confident about thinking about how and why we have benefited and what we can do to rectify that and bring some of those advantages to others, whether it's resources. I'm always thinking about what I've learned from Barbara and the notion that we simply listen and just try to move forward in appropriate ways. We can't change the past, but in knowing about it, we can build a better future. What was interesting when I was reading about the foundation of St. Philip the Deacon, the African-American priest who was initially brought in was a deacon. And so you get the sense that was a position that African-American priests were held to, that they weren't allowed to be, or that it was the rare one who was ordained. And they would typically have to spend much longer in that diaconate role than white priests. And yet the comments that I found about him in the Oregonian were excited to build on his parish. There were, he comes in and there's 60 parishioners and he's hopeful to grow that congregation. It's all, I think even though it's the 20th century, I think it's all still remarkably murky. We know a little bit about the early founders. So Ron asked about more specifics about the early prominent individuals at Trinity were influential in Portland or Oregon in matters of race and inclusion, and the exclusion and non-inclusion laws. So when the Chinese Exclusion Acts became federal law in the 1880s, Matthew Deedy, who was one of our vestry members, worked very hard to make sure that the Chinese citizens who were already here were protected from violence, and he was quick to, offer protection to those citizens. At the same time, his fellow vestry member, Sylvester Penoyer, as governor, worked. His plea was to the common working man. He wanted to, the working white man. He ran on a platform that said, get the Mongolians out. So while one member of our vestry is working hard to protect people of Asian descent on the one hand, someone else on the vestry in political power is doing the exact opposite. So I think as a congregation, we're going to find all of those things, a full range of attitudes and approach to race. 100 years later, Dagwell was was a member of the Public Housing Authority, seeking to make sure that people had, that there was a fair distribution of housing for people of all races, and trying to make housing accessible. And yet what was the actual work of the Public Housing Authority? I just haven't, I haven't been successful at finding out a lot of, really helpful information in this regard. Yes, Matthew.
Yeah, I think, Kimberly, the fact that we have somebody with your talent and skill who's really unable to kind of dig up much says a lot, actually. That silence speaks volumes, that there isn't a clear historical record of activism or solidarity or engagement with this issue is itself, compelling evidence of white supremacy as it operates most of the time, which is in the form of indifference, right? And nonetheless, I do hope that once you are able to get into the diocesan archives, we can find out something. For example, I know my parents were very involved in ESCRU, the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, which was the civil rights voice for the Episcopal Church in the 60s. And I wonder if there was an Oregon chapter of that society.
Right.
And I would imagine if there would be some record of it somewhere.
Right.
But that's the kind of thing you'd find in the archives, which you can't get into. So.
Right. I did some reading about the Episcopal Society on Culture and Racism, and it's on the site that I was reading about it. The sense is that the presiding bishop, kind of allowed their work without really supporting him as deeply as he might, mainly because there was pushback from parishioners. And so in that sense, you have a leader who's willing, but again, there's a resistance to really push people as far as you need to push them. And that, again, complacency and willingness to let the status quo remain is, one of our sins as we think about our own complicity, and then trying to really find a way to move forward is what we hope to do. As I think I mentioned last time, one of my favorite lines is that silence implies acceptance. And so it's the more we can talk about it and the more we can learn, the better off we'll be.
One of the things underlying Ron's comment, I think that's kind of interesting about whether there were any significant people of color presence at Trinity, meaning I think on the vestry or just as members or parishioners. Do we know any of that history in terms of whether there was any diversity?
I think my understanding is that people were excluded from leadership roles and were encouraged to, encouraged to find a church home elsewhere. And I assume that changed in the 70s and 80s, but I don't actually know for sure. I'm always astonished at how, when I read more, how long attitudes lingered. And yet, when we look at the world around us at the moment, it's sort of obvious at some level as to why that's so.
It's interesting, going back to St. Philip the Deacon. Some research I've done shows that one of our parishioners, in particular, Blaine Cole, before the war, was very active in promoting St. Philip the Deacon as a parish, and he may have been instrumental in getting the deacon there. At the same time, this gets back to some of the other questions. Why St. Philip the Deacon in Albina? Well, Portland was redlined in those days. The only neighborhood that African Americans could live in and could find financing to buy a home was Albina, and that was part of the way the realtors had set up Portland, essentially, for a long time. And we have neighborhood churches. The church one might go to would be the church in your neighborhood, and the only neighborhood you could live in would be Albina. So there's some of that going on too. So I think there's a lot of admiration for folks like Blaine Cole to help establish St. Philip the Deacon. The reality of it is that Portland was a segregated city, and that was the only place where African Americans who wanted to be Episcopalians could worship, probably. One might come to that thought after looking at it. So it's the time that it was, and so it's admirable. At the same time, we have questions.
I think the other points worth considering are, trying to find the jewels of people who were speaking differently, and the response to those people. So there's a long comment. I can't read all of it. So Matthew.
Oh, thanks. I didn't mean to throw that in like that. That's just information about, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. The class is going to be beginning Wednesday evening, January 27th. We're going to have Randy Woodley, who's a prominent Native American scholar and activist and theologian who's here in Portland. He will be doing a class on the doctrine of discovery and the legacy of racism with respect to Native American populations in Oregon. So I just wanted to alert people to that class.
Excellent.
Wednesday evenings.
That sounds looking a good place. Really helpful to think about what he has to offer us in this conversation. As you, if we think about silence as complicity, what thoughts does that bring to mind? What does that help you? Is that helpful, or is that more? Is it not helpful? I guess. In thinking about how we understand where we are now, is that, we see the sins of our forefathers and mothers, and then trying to root, and yet while understanding that each time had its own difficulties and complexities, and can you take people out of their historical moment? We really can't. But at the same time, there were people writing, W.E.B. Du Bois, to name one, early other African-American scholars, constantly, as we look back now, saying the same thing that people are saying now. You know, that white people don't see race, or that, and yet, how can we miss it? And how can we not understand the struggles that they were facing, both in the South, where, you know, it was really, you know, you had basically very few rights that were understood, if any. And then but as those populations moved north and west, they were still, you know, by far the great majority were held in positions of service. In the Kaiser period in Vanport, the Boilers Union kept the African-American workers out of the best paid position because the union was made up of white people, and they were very concerned about the African-Americans taking the black workers taking their jobs. So none of this is new. In fact, you know, it's old. And then trying to figure out how, you know, what we can learn from that, and then how to move forward. Does anyone want to talk more about the doctrine of discovery? Because I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with the term. Does anyone want to address that? I feel like I'm surrounded by experts. So,
David Mitchell is the one who really brought this to my attention, and I see David's on the line. David?
More specifically, we could call it the doctrine of Christian discovery that was instituted by one of the popes, and I can't remember offhand, that if you go to a place and there are no Christians there, just heathen, and you discover it, then you're in charge, basically. And so that has been used really around the country and around the globe for all sorts of offenses, and was really, until recently, still accepted.
Yeah, the notion that as Christians, we have the, you know, because we have our direct line to God, that we can go in and impose that our beliefs on others. And the perception that people of different races were, to some degree, especially if we look at the approach to Native Americans, or indeed to the Black community, that this was, they were meant to be separate, and they were meant to be dominated. That there was this, I think, Barbara, you know, that understanding that people who look different were incapable of doing anything except working for white people, and with religious approval of that from the Pope and then from succeeding generations. At some level, it's not surprising that we are where we are now. But I do think I'm looking forward, Matthew, to hearing someone who knows more than I do about the way that worked in practice over many generations. Is something that I think can help us as we do this work.
There's a whole stream of United States law that really flows from the doctrine of Christian discovery, mm-hmm. that Stephen Newcomb, another Native American author, has uncovered, and a way of thinking that promulgates, that feeds into that legal stream of things.
Right.
And it's all the way up to a Supreme Court decision.
Right.
And it's still really woven into some of our laws.
Right.
Again, in a hidden way, like we've been talking about this morning.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the great mysteries, well, at some level, it's not a mystery, but as I read about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon, why it was so successful here, and the ways in which it presented itself as a community builder, that they had that they were worried about every other, different faiths, as well as, everything outside of mainline Protestantism, how happy people seemed to be to join it. And then only after it became clear that they were an organization of violence did people sort of drift away from it. And that, and yet, it's not, we're not in the South. At the same time, I think the smaller numbers of people of color really make that sort of thing easier. David, did you get a source that you wanted to share?
I did go get the book. I can just type it in the chat here. It's Pagans in the Promised Land: Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery by Stephen Newcomb.
Kimberly, I'd just like to reiterate that, when Train first started doing its research, it's really hard to find specific things about our church. And so I think that the absence of information is the most telling.
Right,
So
right.
As a group in Train a few years ago, we decided to really focus on trying to uncover the history of racism in our state.
Right.
Because there's so much that was buried. And so, I mean, and the more I learn, the more I realize the less I know.
Right.
But for example, one thing I just learned this past year, there's the group called the Oregon Black Pioneers, and we had one presentation by them.
Yeah.
They talked about how the only reason why we said we would be an anti-slavery state was because we wanted to be a state.
Right. That was the we dreaded to get into the union.
Right. And we wanted to negotiate, and we wanted to have exclusion laws for against the Chinese. So, that's how we negotiated back and forth. And it's the insidiousness of the institutional racism.
Right.
And I really do agree with something Keith said in the chat, is that the history that I put in the chat does kind of try to shed the positive light. Right.
Yeah, because we need to know who recognized and who among us recognized how we could, make us a better community, how we could understand those who live differently than we do, and how we could see them all as children of God, not as the other. And
so I do also think that part of the Episcopal Church initiative that Liz points out in 2009, when they repudiated the doctrine of discovery, they moved forward with the whole movement of becoming beloved community.
Right.
What's been done and what hasn't been done.
Right.
In order for us to learn and then move forward. And so there are some kind of, I think, significant turning points. We were going to focus on, as a group, deep dives into the history of one of the marginalized groups, and then try to develop a way to have pilgrimages where we would develop some form of reconciliation. Like, I don't know that we've ever had a service as a group.
Right.
Of repentance. There are many things that we could talk about doing, but the pandemic is kind of put a hole in it. A big
on the one hand, it gives us a lot of time to reflect and time to read more and try to know more. And yet we're still kind of cloistered in our boxes.
Yeah.
And it's really nice to see all of you here and all of us who are interested in learning more, and we can do that and at least, find common ground to understand, what we can do going forward. These are all great questions. And I think Matthew and Barbara, yeah, the silence in some ways is telling. And it's reasonable to look for the bright spots on the other hand, always knowing that the weight of complicity might have drowned those out to some degree.
Kimberly, can I say something?
Yeah, of course, Jeffrey.
I think your statement, I've been thinking a lot about the silence is complicity statement. And although I agree with it, I would have to qualify that by saying silence is a privilege afforded to people who are white.
Right.
If you are not white, you don't have the privilege. You either are silent and you suffer the consequences of that silence,
Right.
or you are not silent and you suffer the consequences of not being silent. But either way, you lose.
Right.
And
right.
I think that's really important to remember.
Right.
And I was also going to ask if it might be possible to have a copy of the chat put up on the Trinity website
Mm-hmm.
so that other people can have access to it.
Right.
And, I think it's wonderful that there's 20 of us here, but 20 people is a very small percentage of our community. And so to just encourage everyone to invite other people to attend, because I think that we're living in a time when working toward this kind of justice is no longer an option, it's a necessity.
Yeah.
So I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to.
Well said, Jeffrey. Well said. Thank you.
On that note, I'll encourage everyone to stay tuned for Nathan's sermon this morning. I believe that our deacon Ken was originally scheduled to preach, and Nathan decided to take the pulpit to address the events of this past week. So stay tuned for that.
Great. Okay, everybody, I think we should get ready for church, but I really appreciate your coming, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week.